The last speaker reminded me of my past life. I was chief of pediatrics at Fort McPherson, my last tour of duty. And I can honestly say the pediatric ward had not been repainted since the Spanish-American War. I arranged for to break Army regulations. I had Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman painted on the ceilings and the walls, and it was against Army regulations, but they put up with, in addition, the penitentiary, when I was in the Army, we had a handball team, the 3 or 4 of us, and we would play the penitentiary on Sundays. I thought I was a good handball player until I met these guys. They were all there for 20 years and they played handball every day. And, it was an interesting experience. Cy asked me to talk about the health care of American troops in Europe. These are the statistics. There were 378,000 men in the military, that's the Army and the Navy, prior to the war. By the end of the war, we had 4.7 million, of which 600,000 were in the Navy and the Marines. The medical corps, 30% of all the physicians in the United States went into the military. There was a tremendous shortage of not only physicians in communities around this country, but also nurses. During the flu epidemic of 1918, communities around Georgia and even in South Carolina contacted Atlanta and wanted to know if they could borrow some nurses. There were none available. The Red Cross was a small organization prior to the war. 107 chapters around the country. By the end of the war, 3,800 chapters. Known dead. Now, some of these statistics, depending on who you read, they're going to vary. And some of the things I'm going to tell you may not be true, but I believe. Known dead, 107,000. Wounded, seriously, 43,000. Wounded, 148,000. And missing, 4,900. These men were obliterated by artillery shells. And their bodies were eaten by rats. There were 2 million rats, they think, in the trenches in Western Europe. At first they thought they would wipe them out, and then they realized they were performing a public service. They were eating the remains of the men killed on no man's land. Battle wounds in 1918, this is a survey over the year of 227. Now some of these men were wounded twice, so they've been counted twice. And some of them in American military hospitals were also probably French and British. But influenza, there were 340,000 American troops ill with influenza. Okay, Chris, where are you? The first major illness that we faced was influenza. It was called H1N1 today. Back in my day, when I was in medical school, we had influenza A and influenza B. The H stands for hemagglutination, and the N stands for neuroamidase. There are 15 H's and 9 N's. So it's very difficult for somebody to come up with a vaccine based on all the numbers that are potential. So next year it may be H5 and N6, and the following year it may be H4 and N5. So it's a very complicated subject. We had 675,000 Americans die with the influenza epidemic. The United States military suffered 49,000 deaths, of which 26,000 of these people died here in this country, and another 23,000 died overseas. These are the symptoms of influenza. If you ever had it, if you haven't had your vaccine, you need to go get it. I would get it by the end of October, simply because flu epidemic lasts probably until about May, and the vaccine usually lasts 5 or 6 months. So I wouldn't ever get it in August, like some people do, but I would get it by the end of this month. The cause of death in these people was some people died, some of the military, the soldiers died very quickly. It was a superbacterial infection. There's an organism that we find in children called Haemophilus influenza. They thought that that germ caused the deaths from flu. In reality, it was not, but the name influenza stuck with it. Now, some people died several days later, and they died from hemorrhage in their lungs and edema. The 200,000 Americans died in October of 1918 from influenza. The numbers are just staggering. The first thing after influenza that we came across was poison gas. Now, some of these gases, the French started it first. They used tear gas. It didn't work very well. Then in January of 1918, the Germans loaded 18,000 artillery shells on the Eastern Front, Eastern Poland, against the Russians, and filled them with bromine and fired them at the Russians over a several-day period. When the shells exploded, they thought it was going to turn into a poison gas. This is the middle of the winter in Eastern Poland. So the shells exploded, the stuff went out and then precipitated into crystals. So it laid on the ground and did no harm. So it was the last time the Germans used that kind of a weapon. There were three of them: chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas. The phosgene, first of all, the April 1915, there were 20,000 casualties at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. Now, most of these were Canadians, and they were French, Senegalese troops. There were no masks. The leadership of the Western armies knew that the Germans had poison gas, and they did nothing about it. So when this gas attack occurred, there were 20,000 casualties. There were some deaths. Most of the deaths were due to men who had already been wounded, lying on the ground in stretchers, and the gas came, and that ended up killing them. The main killer of poison gases was phosgene, and that was used in December 1915. And then the mustard gas. Now, mustard gas is horrible, but we had it in World War II. Eisenhower put mustard gas on a ship in the Italian peninsula in the town of Barrage. The idea was if the Germans used mustard gas or any kind of a poison gas at the Normandy invasion, we would retaliate. The problem was the ship was hit by German airplanes, the gas escaped, and consequently about 600 people died. The interesting thing about the mustard gas was when the men were put into the hospital in Barrage, their white counts were very low. So two doctors from New York go there and realize this could be a treatment for leukemia, lower the white counts. And so this is really, for all practical purposes, to me, the beginning of chemotherapy. I'm undergoing chemotherapy right now, so I suggest that you stay away from it. The mustard gas was kind of horrible in the sense that it caused lesions of the eyes. And the other big problem was all these other gases dissipated, but mustard gas sat on the ground. So if you leave your trench, say you retreat, and then you come back 2 days later and you sit on the ground in your trench, you can burn your legs and your buttocks, your back if you're leaning against the wall. So this went on and on and on. And these are the casualties. Now, these numbers are probably inaccurate in the sense that nobody knows how many people in Belgium and France, citizens, civilians, died from these gases. These gases were used around towns, like the chlorine gas was used at Ypres in Belgium for the first time. The Russians had inadequate masks. Everybody did initially. When the gas attack first occurred, nobody had a mask. And so soldiers figured out, well, they would take a piece of flannel, soak it in their urine, and put it over their faces, thinking that the ammonia would deactivate the chlorine, for instance. We had 1,462 deaths from poison gases. About, it says here, we had about 2% death rate. But the numbers are inaccurate. And the other problem is that many men were gassed and then got the flu, and the flu killed them. Probably would not have killed them if they had not been gassed. Do I talk to it? Chris, read it. I'm right here. All right. In the Spanish-American War, we had 142 cases for every 1,000 men that were in Cuba that had typhoid fever. We had over 1,500 deaths from typhoid fever. In 1896 and 1897, an English physician by the name of Wright worked on a vaccine. In about 1908, an American captain in the Army, Captain Fred Russell, went to Great Britain and studied under Dr. Wright. Came back, he supposedly altered the vaccine a little bit for the United States. And in 1909, gave a vaccine, I assume it was to a volunteer, well, I'm not sure, against typhoid fever, and seemed to work. In 1911, the United States Army mandated that everybody get the typhoid vaccine. As a consequence of that attitude, we had the lowest rate of typhoid fever and deaths in World War I of any combatant. It's an amazing, amazing story. We had deaths. The problem was, who died? My opinion, I think there were National Guard people that got through the immunization process of the regular Army. They were called up from states around the United States and escaped immunization. We lost over 1,500 men in the Spanish-American War, and it was a small army to typhoid fever. It's a disease of 104 fever, diarrhea, headaches. Cause of death is frequently GI bleeding. You will perforate your bowel, and it has a rash. They call it rose spots. And the organism is Salmonella. Very difficult. It's down in the right-hand corner. It's very difficult. It has these little tails, little flagella, and it's hard to treat. The next illness that we faced was Antivirus. This is from rodents. The saliva, the urine, and the feces of rodents. And like I said, they wanted to keep rats around. Have you ever seen the movie All Quiet on the Western Front? There's a scene there where the Germans are in their bunker, and all of a sudden it's shelling outside, and all the rats start coming in. There were at least 2 million rats, they think, on the Western Front. When somebody got killed and was lying in no man's land, the first thing the rat would eat would be your eyes. And then they went for your liver. And it was really horrific. But nobody wanted to get rid of them because they took care of the decomposition. And the rats, they claim, I haven't ever seen a picture of them, claim that they were the size of cats. This is a disease. It has that palmalovirus. That's a village in Finland. It's an interesting illness in the sense that it doesn't really kill you, but it's still around. We have outbreaks in Seattle among homeless people. We had an outbreak in 1999 in the Four Corners of the United States. The Native Americans requested that it not be called the Four Corners disease because it cut down on tourism. But so this stuff is still around. The British had 400 deaths, and we had 115 deaths. The problem with it is that your rehabilitation takes weeks and weeks and weeks, and sometimes, up to 6 months. The diagnosis was usually made by another soldier looking at you, and you've got the disease. He would say, "My God, your face is swollen." And then the other said, "Yeah, well, I'm peeing red." Well, that was the diagnosis. Typhus. When you see pictures of World War I, you'll see American troops lined up, all clean shaven, nice pressed uniforms, well fed, and they're getting sprayed. And so at the end of the war, we said, "Oh my God, we had no typhus." That was a successful spraying program. Well, the reality of it was there wasn't any typhus on the Western Front. Typhus was in the Eastern Front, and it was in Serbia. In the war, 1915, and the Austrians entered Serbia, 150,000 people died the first year of the war from typhus. 120,000 Serbian civilians, and another 30,000 prisoners of war. There were 400 doctors in Serbia in 1915. 150 of them died of typhus. But there was no typhus on the Western Front. So they were bragging about, God, what a great deal. And they were spraying the men with Lysol. Lysol is a very toxic substance. It goes to the Lysol, I don't know about the stuff we use today, but back in those days, it contained creosote. And I worked with creosote when I worked in the mines. And man, I had burns on my neck and arms that I could use a plastic surgeon back in those days. But anyway, it's a rickettsial disease. It's called rickettsia prowazekii. It's a strange name, but rickettsia comes from a physician by the name of Ricketts, who studied the disease and died as a result of studying it. And the prowazekii part, the second part, comes from an Eastern European physician who died in South America from studying the disease. It's an intracellular, that is, the organism enters the body and goes to the cells and multiplies. At the end of the war, 30 million Eastern Europeans and Russians had typhus. There were 3 million deaths. So it's an incredible illness. We still get it around this country, a few of them, probably 1,000 a year, but it's still around. And it's from body lice. What I'm going to tell you next is, I'm not sure it's true, but the British soldiers used to call lice chats. So they would sit in their tents and, or in their trenches, and they would kill the chats. They would chatter with each other. And so some people say the term "he's chattering" came from World War I as a result of the body lice. Not say a body lice that's well fed, it's just bitten a human. Chris, University of Georgia has better stuff. We know that typhus did not exist because body lice existed on the Western Front. It was a disease called trench fever. And Chris, why don't you come up here and just stand? I didn't do anything. What's that? For you.
That is beyond me, so continue without it, so we go get the person who can help me with that.
Trench fever. It's also from lice.
Somebody's pulling apart.
Am I starting to sing? There were 500,000 British troops with trench fever. And not a killer, but a very, very debilitating illness. So it's hard to fight a war when you have 500,000 men lying around like this in the right-hand corner in a building resting. We had 743 cases. We got involved in the war late. We fought in the war for 200 days of battle. We were involved in 13 battles. If you take out the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where we lost 26,000 men killed, the war was not much other than influenza. But again, body lice, that's the organism. It's a rickettsial disease, and it's a bacteria, and it has a second name, Bartonella quintana. But it is not a real killer, but it's very, very debilitating. Severe trauma. You know, these artillery shells and machine guns that they used resulted in severe, severe trauma. The British had 240,000 amputations. The United States, a little over 2,000. We had 1 triple amputee. Now, what was the difference? Well, the difference was sophistication. We started using rubber gloves with surgeons. We started using masks. We started using portable x-ray machines. Madame Curie developed a vehicle that went out to the front and took x-rays. So instead of some doctors trying to stick his finger with no gloves on in a wound trying to find the shrapnel pieces, they could get an x-ray and locate it. And then the other thing is they started to use debridement. They started cutting off and out the dead tissue. They started doing that in France in 1815, but people forgot about it. They just forgot about it. And so it came back. And then they started using liberally antiseptics. Hydrogen peroxide is 1816. Iodine is 1811, is when it came out. And potassium permanganate is 1659. I mean, this stuff has been around and people forgot about it. And then all of a sudden they started using it very, very liberally and have saved a lot of Americans from losing their limbs. Shell shock. Tough problem. The British think that 4% of their troops had shell shock. The idea was that concussion from the shells just sort of penetrated the brain and damaged brain tissue. You know, if you have ever seen photos of the men that were wounded with shell shock, they've got this, what they call a 1,000-yard stare. Their eyes are wide open and they're staring into space. When I was in medical school in the early 60s, I lived in a psychiatric hospital. Some people thought I should have been a patient there, but I took care of people who had shell shock from the Korean War. Still there. The British had about 80,000 men with shell shock. Many of them stayed in homes well up into World War II. The United States, by 1921, we had over 5,000 men declared shell shock victims. And the Meuse-Argonne battle, which started September 27, 1918, and lasted until the Armistice Day, November 11th, we had a lot of influenza people and a lot of shell shock. This was a continuous battle. Tetanus. The tetanus started out at the beginning of the war. First 3 months of the war, the Germans had over 1,700 cases of tetanus, with 75% mortality. The British had about 1,500 cases, with probably the similar mortality. The problem was where they were fighting. They were fighting on fields. They were farm fields. They've been farming those fields for 400 years. They were fertilized with manure, which contains the organism. And when the shells blew up, uprooting all of this stuff, including the organism, Clostridium, and people got tetanus. In the 1880s, they started making syrup from horses, anti-tetanus toxin, and it worked. So they started using it prolifically. It was unbelievable. Everybody who got wounded received it. In World War II, in the Italian campaign, we had penicillin. Everybody, every American soldier that got wounded got a shot of penicillin. And what did it do? It wiped out gas gangrene, which was a major illness in prior wars. And this, every corpsman carried, I don't know how many vials of this stuff he carried, but anybody who was wounded in the Italian campaign got a shot of penicillin, and gas gangrene went down to zilch. It took about, in World War II, it took an American soldier who was wounded 9 hours to get back to healthcare. It took the British 12 hours. And gas gangrene can set in 1 hour. So the corpsman giving a shot of penicillin just wiped out that disease. We had 23 cases in the war. Nobody died, supposedly. I had 2 cases of tetanus in my medical career. Both died. It wasn't my fault. But I had one. I was an intern. The guy shows up in the emergency room, and I'm on an ER call. And he comes in and got lockjaw. First I thought he was psychotic, and then I examined him. He had a gaping wound in his head. He had been robbed. He was homeless. California, was robbed, beaten up. Came in about 2 weeks later after his assault and had tetanus, and he ended up dying. I called the police to report a homicide. And they looked at me and said, you know, where was he hurt? Downtown. Who did it? No clue. I mean, so anyway, the homicide, I think, went unanswered, but they started cleaning out the tissues. Debridement, started by the French in the early 1850s, and exercised all the nasty material. And these are the other diseases that we had. Tuberculosis, measles, meningitis, diarrhea. The American nurse, Camille O'Brien, that died in World War I, attached to the Everett unit, she had meningitis. We had venereal disease. Now, it probably didn't kill anybody in the war, but there were 6.8 million in the United States Army, 6.8 million days lost. The treatment, probably worse than my chemo. They would take potassium permanganate, which was created in 1659, and inject it up into your urethra. I would have to say I'd rather have a root canal. And then and for syphilis, they give mercury shots, which is also very toxic. So, you know, your kidneys will shut down from mercury, or, you know, anyway, that was the treatment. And again, this is the casualties. 107,000 American men died, of which 63,000 of them died from disease. Influenza was the main one. 49,000 men died from influenza. Tragic. And missing 4,900, these are bodies that were never found, obliterated by artillery shells. Any questions?
Thank you, Ronnie.
Excellent.
I need a volunteer to take my chemo this afternoon.
effort to maximize actual presentation time and try to get a little bit back on schedule, we'll forego the introductions entirely. You could read about them in the playbill. Go to it, Sean.
Well, I'm Richard Faulkner from the Commanding General Staff College, the Army Commanding General Staff College at beautiful Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which had snow on the ground when I took off yesterday to land in 81-degree weather. So if I lose my voice, I'll do the rest of this presentation with mime and interpretive dance. I'm a local boy. I grew up in Kennesaw. And in Kennesaw, not only did I learn my love of history, but also a fascination with World War I. This is a major battlefield in Kennesaw, the American Civil War, or as my mother still calls it, the war between the Americans and the Yankees. But they had the trenches there, and this sort of fascinates me. And I got to tell you, if you want to study the Great War, you don't need to have a depressive personality. Okay? And I got to tell you, it has definitely given me a more pessimistic view of mankind. We have two big things that are happening in the 50 years prior to the Great War that are going to all come together in this collision in 1914. One is the Second Industrial Revolution. And the Second Industrial Revolution brings in a host of new weapons and also now gives nations the ability to mass produce these weapons in heretofore unimaginable numbers. The second breakthrough is the state managerial revolution. And now as states start to grow in power and their administrative abilities grow, they can now create armies of huge magnitudes. Now let's start with the technology. Here at Georgia Tech, most of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be technology. And I'll focus mostly on the military ground technology that encompass the Western Front. This afternoon I'll talk more about how the U.S. Army interacted with the technology. Here are the big three, and I have it here to sort of show the differences. This amazing firepower revolution that takes place in the 50 years between the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of World War I. On the left, you have the major weapon systems of the American Civil War. And I threw the Gatling gun in just to make a comparison. Okay? The one on the top is the one that's the biggest battlefield killer, the rifled musket. And the soldier of the American Civil War was going to get off 3 aim shot a minute, if he was lucky and a trained marksman, maybe to 400 or 500 meters. The artillery of the American Civil War, muzzle-loading artillery, because it was a muzzle loader, was only getting off 1 to 2 shots a minute. Max range, no more than 2,000 meters. Then comes some amazing technological breakthroughs. Starting in 1884 with a Frenchman named Paul Viel. And Viel invents smokeless powder. Makes some big changes in warfare. First of all, it's not completely smokeless, but it is definitely creating a lot less smoke on the battlefield than you had with black powder. So it's going to make it easier to command and control, but it also leads to something called the invisible battlefield. That without a big signature, if you're not actually seeing the muzzle flash, it's going to be hard for you to pick up enemy forces. Paul Viel's invention also creates much higher velocity. Higher velocity does 2 things. One, much greater range. So by the time you get to the armies of World War I, the weapons are technically capable. The infantry rifles that Dave has laid out here are technically capable to reach out to 2,000 meters. Realistically, with trained soldier, 600 to 800 meters. You match that up with the bolt action system, and while the Civil War soldier was getting off 3 aim shots a minute, by the time you get to World War I, your trained infantrymen were getting off 15 to 25 shots a minute. The next great invention is by another American, Hiram Maxim. He's one of these fascinating guys that America throws up from time to time. He has about a 7th grade formal education, but he is a natural when it comes to electrical and mechanical engineering. In fact, one of my favorite stories is, in 1884, he's in Vienna to receive an award for his work in electricity. While he's there, he runs to a friend of his. The friend says, Hiram, hang your electricity. If you want to make a barrel of money, invent something to allow these Europeans to slit each other's throat with a greater facility. Now, Hiram, as a good American, liked a challenge and wanted to make a barrel of money. So he goes back to his workshop, and in 1886, he comes out with the Maxim gun, the world's first true automatic weapon. He does that by using physics. Each action has an equal but opposite reaction. He harnesses the explosive power of that new smokeless powder, puts a big spring on the side of the gun, the bullet firing pushes back the bolt, automatically ejects the cartridge, the bolt catches the spring, is pulled back in the battery, automatically loading the next cartridge. When you automate fire, you now have a weapon system, an infantry weapon system capable of 500 or 600 rounds a minute. Now there's a problem. That's going to build up a lot of heat. But again, Max is the practical guy. He says if I surround the barrel with a hollow jacket and fill it full of water, the water will dissipate the heat. That's why it's called a water-cooled machine gun. But the problem with these machine guns as it enters World War I is their great weight. The MG08, the standard machine gun of the German army that's pictured here, weighs 124 pounds. That's going to be a problem. Last but not least is the champion of the World War I battlefield, modern artillery. This is the French 75 gun. It's the world's first modern artillery piece. A couple things that make it modern. It has a very slick operating breech, which makes for quick loading. The ammunition is right here. This is for a French 75 gun. One handy dandy package. You have the primer, you have the powder, you have the shell, you have the fuse. So again, it's very easy for the cannoneer to load it. The range is going to increase up to 8,000 meters. The other thing is underneath the barrel there's a recoil mechanism. You see a Civil War cannon fire, the minute you pull the lanyard, it goes rolling back in recoil and then has to be laboriously pulled back in and re-aimed. That's why the rate of fire is so low. With the French 75 gun, it's capable of a surge rate of fire of 20 rounds a minute. In other words, for a period of time, those French artillerymen can fire that cannon as rapidly as an infantryman can operate their rifle. So now we have a problem. You've had a massive increase in the amount of battlefield technology. You're getting hit at further ranges and you're being hit with a much greater density of firepower. And one of the questions of the Great War is, did the generals actually understand this? They absolutely do. But knowing about it and being able to do something about it are two different things. In fact, we're facing the same challenge when it comes to getting our minds around cyber warfare today. We know it's there, we know it's going to be bad, but we don't know what to do about it. So as these armies go off to 1914, we have a few problems. First of all, thanks to that managerial revolution, that second industrial revolution, you have symmetrical armies. They are raised mostly through conscription, with the exception of the United States and Great Britain, at least in the beginning. They are armed the same, they are organized the same, and they even have the same style of training. Here the Prussians are the victims of their own success and their wars of unification. Now this is a bad thing in war. When you have symmetrical armies banging into each other, it's like two porcupines making sweet, sweet love. Okay? If you're not careful, somebody's going to get very hurt very quick. They hope, and you love this word with this used in military parlance, they hope that if they mobilize faster and move faster and attack faster, they may be able to catch the other guy mid-mobilization and gain that critical asymmetric battlefield advantage. And of course, the Schlieffen Plan of August 1914, the Schlieffen-Mochen Plan, is the Germans' attempt to overcome the ugliness of this battlefield. And as we all know, for a host of reasons, that plan fails miserably. And so by November of 1914, the troops start to dig in. And the troops start to dig in because they have to shelter from the fury that is this new battlefield. And once you dig in, there's only one way to get you out. And I'll say this without any reservation, this is what World War I's about, artillery. As Henri Pétain, who we'll come back to repeatedly in today's lecture, says, artillery conquers, infantry merely occupies. To get the enemy out of the trenches, you need the artillery to first suppress the enemy fire, keep down their infantry, destroy their machine guns, suppress their artillery, destroy their field fortifications, and flatten the artillery. Flatten the barbed wire. Now that's a lot to ask. And in the process of doing that, we see some of the innate problems with technology. It is at one hand the solution, but it's also the creation of multiple other and unanticipated problems. The first one who figured this out is actually, in my estimation, Henri Pétain. Okay? Now, if we put aside that whole collaborating with the Nazi things, you got to admit the guy had it together when it came to understanding military technology. With these huge armies and the need to expend a massive amount of the sky, we need an aviation system I need the aviation to clear out the German observation, but more importantly, I need the aviation to protect the French aviation. If I can see, I can use the artillery as a hammer. But that now leads to the next system. If I'm relying on the artillery to do the vast majority of the killing, and in World War I, artillery accounts for 70% of the war's casualties, I've got to have a lot of artillery. And as Dr. Solomon pointed to today, this is what they mean by a lot of artillery. This is the British example in World War I. And they're trying to find out the sweet spot. I'll explain that here in a minute. That at the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, before the war is even a year old, the British are trying to find out how much artillery they need to accomplish their military tasks. And in this Battle of Neuve Chapelle, they actually expend more shells in the first 35 minutes of that battle than the British Army had expended in the entirety of the Boer War. But you'll notice, you go from partial success to partial failure to a little bit less failure to ultimately getting it right, arguably, here in the 14th of July in 1916, okay? Now this was alluded to earlier. This is the sweet spot. In order to accomplish all of those tasks that you need artillery to do to allow the infantry to occupy, the British came up with this solution. 660 pounds of shell per yard of trench. And if you look at your table, that's just a little over a yard. But you'll also notice that after achieving that success, just a couple of months later, they're back to guessing. What this indicates is the learning lessons. Ferdinand Foch, who will ultimately command all of the Allied armies in the West, is reported to have said it takes 15,000 casualties to train a major general. Now that sounds pretty callous, but if you consider the monumental amount of change that's happening in a very short amount of time, Foch is probably right. The British officers are trying to find that sweet spot, and the French and the Germans will do the same thing. The reason that they're not expending all those shells is simply due to the fact that every one of that 660 pounds means that there's a lot of people working in Britain and France producing the shells to pull this off. And you're not sure that you have the money, you're not sure if you have the resources, you don't know if you have the manpower to keep feeding this maw. In fact, the Germans will develop a name for this, the Materialschlacht, the material battle. That the one who will win will be the one who can make all of these systems dance together. And that leads to this system. To keep the shells moving forward, to keep the manpower moving forward, and all the supplies. Bataan is also one of the first ones to understand some of the other technological breakthroughs of the war, most importantly the motor car. Verdun is ill-served by the transportation infrastructure. The Germans are able to interdict the major rail line going in, and there's only a single all-weather road connecting Verdun to the rest of France. It's incredibly vital for the French to hold that open. It's later called the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, this lifeline. And to keep this logistic system open, he will ultimately devote 14 battalions, over 10,000 men, to do nothing more than what you see in that lower corner. Fill in the shell holes, keep them moving. Now we also, because of these changes in this Materialschlacht, see changes in the composition of armies. If you were to look at the American Civil War, the vast majority of the soldiers in all armies are combatants. Guys who carry muskets, guys who fire artillery, cavalrymen with sabers and carbines. By the time you get to World War I, we have a monumental change. This graph shows you the number of tooth-to-tail ratios for the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. In fact, by the time of the armistice in 1918, the Service of Support, the American Army supply network, contains more men than the total army commanded by Lee and Grant in 1864 and 1865. These numbers are actually off, because if you look at the combat troops, that's just numbers of men in combat units. And in your divisions and regiments, you're increasingly devoting more and more manpower just to keep the supplies going forward. Now, we also see the problem with uneven technological development. So while we have monumental changes when it comes to weapons technology, vast increases in lethality, the great technology that lags is communications. In fact, you've got a few breakthroughs. Thanks to Marconi, you do have radios, but radio sets are very heavy and very fragile. So you're really not going to get the radio sets much lower down than the Army level. The modern breakthrough is what Dave brought up here before, the field phones. In theory, it allows communications from the very front line all the way back to the headquarters. In reality, this is a very fragile system. First of all, to get the lines forward, you have our hapless German soldier drawn in the middle. You have a large roll of wire, usually 50 pounds, on a backpack or on a chest pack like here, and as you traipse across no man's land, it automatically spools out. Now that's in addition to carrying all your other gear. So you have a soldier who's carrying about 75 pounds of gear, and on the World War I battlefield, that makes you a slow-moving target. And a slow-moving target on the World War I battlefield is not a healthy person. Even if you lay the wire, it's going to be vulnerable to enemy shell fire. It's even going to be vulnerable to your own soldiers. As your soldiers are moving forward in the attack, the only thing they're concerned about is dying, and they're not concerned about tripping over the wire that the signalers have laid down. The other problem with this is it only connects headquarters to headquarters. So it goes from, if you're lucky, the company headquarters to the battalion headquarters to the division headquarters. It does not go laterally. And that's going to create a couple of problems. The need to control artillery means that you must centralize command and control in order to do the break in, but then you must decentralize command and control down to lowest level to accomplish the breakthrough. And here's where the technology is going to create some problems. This is the British artillery plan for the Battle of Vimy Ridge. This is the creeping barrage. There are no responsive fires like we're used to today. American soldiers since World War II are used to the fact that when you get in trouble, you pray mightily into the radio headset, and magically artillery and aviation appears to bail you out. There's no on-call fires here. You have to plan in detail your operations before you begin. So it tends to make these plans very, very rigid. And if anything happens, as often does on the World War I battlefield, that slows down the advance of the infantry, this rolling barrage is now disappearing over the horizon, and it will never come back. So you will now be out in the open to face the German fire. The other problem with this is the leading to what is called chateau generalship. That these new commanders, these resource managers, can no longer go forward in the battlefield. If you go forward into the battlefield, you lose touch with your units. So increasingly in World War I, they are nailed down to their command posts. And they have been in some ways unreasonably lambasted for that. But the technology is forcing them to do that. If you go forward in the battle as a general officer, you're not commanding anything more than the few soldiers that you have around you. Now, when it comes to the tactical level, the communications that are used, whistles, signal flares, signal flags, are as old as Alexander the Great. So that's going to create a couple of problems on the battlefield that they're going to try to overcome. One is going to be to increase the lethality of the small units. If I'm going to give you the need to exercise initiative at the small level, I need to give you the tools to pull this off. It's also going to lead to a couple of new weapons on the battlefield. Our last speaker discussed chemical warfare, and it's pretty brutally simple. To break the trench stalemate, if I drop poison gas on you, you'll either be too dead, too choking, or too running away to shoot at me as I'm crossing no man's land. And when the Germans first used this at Ypres in 1915, it actually has a monumental success. They knock a hole in the Allied lines 7 miles wide. But that's where the human reality comes in. Try to explain this to the German soldier. hey Hans, we got a cool new weapon, we call it Human Raid. All you've got to do is follow right behind the bouncing green cloud and jump in the British trenches once they're cleared. Now, they're from the state that's next to mine, Missouri. Show me this is going to work. And by the time the German attack gets moving, the Allies manage to counterattack and hold it out. Battlefield technologies, more than any other technologies, have very quick shelf lives. The minute that your enemy invents something that gives them an advantage, you quickly are forced to either copy it, do one better, or find a way to negate it. Within 72 hours of the first use of poison gas, the Allies have already identified that it's chlorine and come up with the first gas mask. Pretty basic. It's a cotton wadding pad with some bicarbonate soda solution that you put in it. You put it over your nose and your mouth, and just for fun, they even give you a pair of steampunk goggles to wear. But it's effective. Chlorine is water soluble, so it negates all that. You don't even have to urinate on it if you keep your bottle of bicarbonate soda. But of course now that chlorine's no longer effective, they go to the next gas, phosgene, as he pointed out before, the great killer gas of World War I. But the minute that you come out with phosgene, you come out with the next gas. And finally in 1917, when mustard gas arrives on the battlefield, again, you come out with a defense against it. So it's a common one-upsmanship when it comes to technology. But this technology is permeating down to the lowest level, fundamentally changing the way that we fight even to this day. This is what a French infantry squad looked like in 1914. Never mind the bright red breeches and the bright blue jacket. Everyone except the officer is armed with a rifle. The officer has a pistol. This is that same French platoon by 1917. It's half the size. It's half the size due to those problems with communications. If I create smaller units with more NCOs and more officers, they're going to be easier to command and control, as I need to disperse on the battlefield to deal with the lethal effects of all that fire. I'm also giving them a new array of weapons, everything from automatic rifles, and Dave has a few of those on display, the Shosho, the world's first mass-produced automatic rifle, the VB rifle grenade, and a whole assortment of offensive and defensive hand grenades. Last but not least, my favorite as a tanker are the tanks. The tanks are another one of these new weapons of war, and they're designed to deal with this trench stalemate. They are essentially mobile, protected firepower. If I have an armored system that is relatively survivable on Caterpillar tractors, it'll be able to cross the shell-torn ground of no man's land, crush the barbed wire in front of the enemy, and with cannons and machine guns that are mounted on them, destroy the enemy's strong points in their machine guns. Well, how do you get a tank in 1915? Because you don't know you need a tank until you need a tank. Well, the British start looking around, and finally they find an American Holt agricultural tractor. Seems to work pretty well on torn ground. They take this Holt agricultural tractor and they bolt on hillbilly armor. Then add in heavy machine guns. Now here's the problem. Holt agricultural tractors are made for plowing fields. And when you put all that armor and all those cannons on it, you're going to have some problems. These things are moving across no man's land at a whopping 1 mile per hour on good dry ground. Now the Whippet tanks, the light ones at the bottom that the British start fielding in 1918 are a little faster. They'll go at 6 miles per hour. You notice something though, is the operational rate of these vehicles. This is the Battle of Amiens, as Ludendorff will say, the Black Day of the German Army. This is the British Army putting together everything they've learned. And by this point, the British can take artillery and mass it. I don't like this grid square, make it go away. But they'll combine that with aviation, moving forward, and then with the tanks to support the infantry. This is a good idea, but the technology has yet to catch up with the demands of what you want the technology to accomplish. So you notice you have 453 that start on the battle on the 8th of August. By the very next day, you're down to 155. Most of these are due to mechanical breakdowns, but the Germans have also learned. They've done simple things like widen their trenches to make the tanks fall into them. They've developed ad hoc anti-tank units with light cannons to knock them out. And by 1918, they even introduced the world's first purpose-built anti-tank weapon, an anti-tank rifle in 13 millimeter. Looks like a big German Mauser that people have put steroids down the muzzle. But if you look by the 11th of August, of the 453 tanks you start with, only 38 are still operational. And if you're the operations officer for the tank corps, you know that you probably have one more battle and then you have no tanks left. But in the process of this learning, in the process of the development of these new technologies, they have created a new model of ground warfare that honestly we still follow in the U.S. Army today. And just to give you an idea of how revolutionary this change is, if you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, put him in a time machine and move him to July of 1914, just before the war begins, he understands this battlefield. Even though there's changes in the technology, the artillery still fights the way that artillery did in his age, the infantry are roughly the same, and the cavalry are doing the same mission. But if you were to take a British infantry battalion commander from August of 1914, put him in a time machine and move him 4 years to the future, he is lost. The pieces parts no longer work the way that they did before. And you have the birth of modern combined arms battle, where all of the arms are coming together to create a synergistic effect. Thank you.
Aviation, is it a footnote to the war or not?
Yes.
Yes. From the infantry and ground pounder perspective. Let's be very clear, very quickly. Aviation has a number of roles that it will evolve over the war. It begins with reconnaissance and observation, see over the next hill, especially when the war goes into trenches. Then you need fighting aircraft, what they call pursuit in World War I, what we call fighter aviation now, to protect those observation craft. You have bombing, both tactical, which means over the front, up to a range usually about 40 miles, which can be done by light single-engine bombers. And then you have the ultimate desire, and that is strategic air power, which means the ability to bomb your enemies' cities, towns, factories, et cetera, et cetera. Strategic aviation remains primarily for the future. It is worth it to note that in 1918, Lord Sir William Weir, who was the Secretary of State for Aviation in Britain, when they formed the Independent Air Force, which actually did only tactical bombing, the aim of the Independent Air Force was to strike at German cities, and as Lord William Weir pointed out, to burn them to the ground. As he put it, the Hun is particularly susceptible to bloodiness. And so if we bomb his cities and set fire to them, this will affect him. It is worth it to note that Sir William Weir was brought back to the Air Ministry in 1936. And so if you wonder why the British set out to burn Germany and German cities to the ground in World War II, Weir had that idea in 1918. They just didn't have the technology to accomplish it. It's also worth it, before I mention what the Americans did, that each major country in the war, major combatants, England, France, and Germany, built about 40,000 aircraft during the war, which surprises most people. They have no idea of the numbers. What differentiates the French from everyone else is that the French are masters of the aviation engine. They build 88,000 aero engines during the First World War, which is twice what the British and Germans build, and they build them superbly. They have the greatest variety. They have rotary engines that rotate, pistons rotate around the crankshaft. They have radial engines in which the pistons are stationary. And these are powerful for the time. These are 270 to 300 horsepower engines. They have inline engines. Then they have V8 engines. Then they have V12 engines. No other country can build that diversity of engines. And the key is that if you do that, that means you've got to supply your allies, because the British engines, other than the Rolls-Royce, are usually burning up before they even get in the air, and the Americans don't have anything. So please keep those things in mind if we think about it. The French are the arsenal of democracy in the First World War, and in particular in the aviation war. They supply the British and the Americans with many of their airplanes and engines. The U.S. declaration of war in April 1917 found military aviation in a woefully unprepared state. With 26 aviators and few airworthy machines, as it had procured only 142 aircraft before 1970. Keep those thousands in your head. Yet American intentions and rhetoric were grandiose, to say the least. General George Squire, chief of the aviation section of the Signal Corps, sought funding to build an air fleet that could, quote, permanently cloud Germany's place in the sun. He invoked images of winged cavalry sweeping across the German lines and smothering their trenches with a storm of lead, which would put the Yankee punch into the war. The automobile manufacturers who controlled Wall Street syndicates, financing America's two largest aviation firms, Curtiss and Wright-Martin, were equally enthused, proclaiming the problems confronting the aircraft industry were, quote, wonderfully simple compared to those of the automobile industry. And then the road to Berlin lies through the air. The eagle must win this war. I love those. It's like, yet at the armistice in November 1918, the U.S. Air Service could muster 45 squadrons with only 457 serviceable airplanes, compared to their Entente counterparts and German counterparts who had between 2,000 and 3,500 planes at the front. This was fewer than half the authorized program. At the end of October, the three pursuit or fighter squadrons, groups as they were by that time, could assemble only a little over half their listed strength of 300 French Spad fighter planes. Yet on July 14, 1970, the House had approved a $640 million appropriation, the largest to that date, for aviation. And so the question is, what happened? First, airplanes, as a logical person would think this, proved far more complicated than automobiles. Automobiles don't fly. If they break down, you're still on the ground. When you fall out of the air, you only, as one British sergeant said, you only fall once, because you don't have a parachute. The Germans introduced them in 1918. We didn't even bother. The British didn't bother. They said the men will become cowards, which is just absurd. So nobody has a parachute except the Germans by 1918. The fastest path to production in the United States lay in copying the best European types. But this isn't easy. The American methods of standardized production that we so highly valued proved incapable of manufacturing airplanes and engines that these highly skilled European craftsmen built themselves from boxes of metal. They could build, if you've ever seen a rotary engine, a rotary engine is literally almost a sculpture. It's a thing of beauty, the fineness of the fins of the engine. We couldn't do anything like that. Only a skilled craftsman could do that kind of thing. The American automotive industry did create, though, the ultimate beast of an engine, 400 horsepower, 12-cylinder Liberty, and installed it in a modified British de Havilland 4 single-engine 2-seat bomber. I'll come back to that. Meanwhile, American flight candidates arrived in Europe, primarily in France, but also in Italy, fall of 1917. Nobody is really ready to receive them. The bulk of them will not come to 1918. They encountered such primitive conditions that one aviator, when asked after the war about his treatment as a prisoner of war in Germany, acerbically answered, "A damn sight better than I got in France as a cadet." Well, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. Those conditions rapidly improved, and by June 1918, 13 American squadrons were operating at the front when the battle moves to Chateau Thierry. There, they encountered, because they'd been on a quiet sector before, they encountered for the first time large concentrations of the vaunted German fighter, the Fokker D-7, which is the one thing that the armistice demands that the Germans have to give up. We want to get a look at those planes to understand why they are so superb at high altitude. The Germans also have stopped fighting individually and in groups of 3. That's why they call them circuses. They fly in 60 plane groups, 4 squadrons, top, down, down, down to the lowest level. You attack anybody, you're going to have a whole bunch of planes on your tail the minute that you hit them. And the Americans are not prepared for this. The Americans in their French Newport 28s, which were basically a second-line French fighter, had to switch to French Spads in order even to be able to deal with the German menace. Then they had to learn to fight in larger units. American reconnaissance crews flew the sturdy French Samson 2A2, radial engine plane, 270 horsepower, incredibly well built. And the Samson could actually outrun German fighters above 15,000 feet. So if you had to do high operations over the lines, you were basically immune to Germans. The tough stuff is the contact patrols over the trenches, where you're flying low and you're really vulnerable to the ground. The day bomber squadron flies the superb French Breguet 14B2, which can also outrun German fighters at altitudes of around 20,000 feet and is well armed. They're in operation in June. But mistakes did occur. You have that one squadron in June. On July 10th, 6, that's one half of the squadron, 6 brigades of the lone U.S. bomber squadron got lost, were forced to land in German territory, and failed to burn their airplanes, prompting the following message from the Germans to the American unit, quote, "We thank you for the fine airplanes and equipment which you sent us, but what will we do with the Major?" Well, never let it be said that the Germans don't have a sense of humor too. The U.S. squadrons judged the American DH-4s inferior to the Brigade for bombardment and the Samson for observation. The Liberty engine at full throttle, the usual engine that the DH-4 used was a Rolls-Royce of 360 horsepower, which is a beautiful engine. The Liberty engine at full throttle shakes the DH-4 into tiny pieces. So if you're trying to escape a German and you shove the throttle to the front, the damn plane falls apart on you and you fall out of the air along with it. The absence of self-sealing fuel tanks situated between the pilot and observer also did not help the morale of air crews, because everybody else has asbestos rubber self-sealing tanks. The DH-4 has a pressure feed gas system that in case of a bullet puncture, the pressure system actually forces the fuel out of the hole over the rest of the aircraft, potentially rendering it a flaming funeral pyre for its crews, hence the nickname Flying Coffin from the DA-4. Yet the American Air Service persevered. Though, like its larger European counterparts, it suffered high casualties, 3/4 of them in training. This is a dangerous business when you take to the air. The notion of 3/4 of them in training. Now, here's the question for the day. How many of you have seen the movie Wings, the 1929 Academy Award-winning movie? Aha. Gary Cooper, his first appearance in a movie is in Wings, and he has the shortest performance of his life. He comes into the tent where the two American flyers are training. He's the pilot trainee. He's got that great smile, dressed to the nines to fly, and they look at, talk to him, silent movie. He goes out and he crashes to his death. That's the end of Gary Cooper role. Keep in mind for the future star. The point is, he is symbolic of what happens to so many of these pilot trainees. Pursuit training takes the highest toll. They have cartoons of aviators on French airfields in 1917, 18, and British aviators on British airfields walking along, just kind of chatting, and all of a sudden they hear, you see them look up, they hear the whir of an engine, and in the French one, it says, another one. And the guy replies, never mind, it's war, c'est la guerre. They're falling out of the air all the time. 300 British trainees, pilot trainees, in 3 months in 1918. This is just a fatal business. Pursuit training takes the highest toll, night bombing the next, day bombing, and lastly observation. That presumes you even got out of primary training. By the offensive at Sam Hill in September 1918, Colonel Billy Mitchell commanded or had access to nearly 1,500 airplanes. That is the largest concentration of Allied airplanes during the war. Keep in mind, more than half of the airplanes were from the French Air Service, from the French Aerial Division. The other, less than half, were American squadrons. But by October, they will be eroded to the point that you saw those numbers that I quoted at the beginning of 450 planes. Well, in August 1918, the Senate Committee Report on Aircraft Production ascribed the disappointing results to the aircraft manufacturers' control of the program and concluded that a substantial part of the $640 million appropriation had simply been squandered. Ironically, and for those of you who like me, the bright spots, true successes in American aviation production, were Glenn Curtis's flying boat designs that the British actually adopted for service on their demanding North Sea patrols, and the U.S. Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia, which is the other one, which actually built the Felix Stowe flying boats that the British used, the F-5Ls, but put Liberty engines in them effectively because the boats were large enough and well built enough to handle them. And so the aviation effort, and we don't discount the valor and the ability of Americans to fly and fight in combat, but what you realize is that without our allies, in particular the French, we wouldn't have had anybody in the air in combat in the First World War. Thank you.